Well, I think it's 9 o'clock. So, welcome to Bedtime Stories for the Architecture Foundation's 100-Day Studio. I'm Jo van Heyningen, and I'm going to read to you a couple of passages from Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. When I was a teenager, I wanted to become an architect, but my school advised me against it. They said it wasn't a suitable profession for women. And instead I read French and Russian at university. And that's not something I regret. 3 years of reading lots of great European literature is a marvelous experience. Stendhal, Balzac, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. I had a great time. But I did feel guilty about something, and that was that I hadn't quite tackled Proust. Everybody had told me how difficult it was. And so, like very many people, I was put off. I finally launched into it when I think I'd just qualified as an architect. And I had these Livre de Poche edition back here, 7 volumes, which I bought one at a time. And I read it over about 2 years with gaps in between. And it was the start of a long fascination with Proust, who turned out, instead of being difficult, well, he wasn't exactly easy, but the main point is that he was engaging and absorbing and funny and sexy and told a very good story. His huge gift to his reader, which is particularly a gift during this pandemic, when we must rely on our own resources, is properly to see and relish and describe the ordinary things of the world about him. His relevance is also that he was the ultimate self-isolator. Although he was a socialite and was part of a glamorous milieu of writers and artists and musicians and grandees, as painted by his contemporary Vuillard, he cut himself off from all this for the last several years of his life because he was ill and because he absolutely needed to write his great oeuvre. In the last 2 years of his life, he confined himself to bed, rather like Aunt Leonie in the first extract I'm going to read, and wrote all night. He died in 1922 with the 7th and final volume finished in draft, but in unpolished form. Tonight I'm going to read 2 extracts. The second one is the best known passage from the whole of In Search of Lost Time, from the first volume, in which we meet the author as a child, living at home with his brother and parents in Paris, but spending a large part of each year in the family's holiday house in a small Normandy town which he calls Cambrai. The first visit of the year was always at Easter. My Aunt Leonie, since her husband's death, had gradually declined to leave first Cambrai, then her house in Cambrai, then her bedroom, and finally her bed, and now never came down, but lay perpetually in an indefinite condition of grief, physical exhaustion, illness, obsessions, and religious observances. My aunt's life was now practically confined to 2 adjoining rooms, in one of which she would rest in the afternoon, while the other was aired. They were rooms of that country order which fascinate our sense of smell and the countless odours springing from their own special virtues, wisdom, habits, a whole secret system of life, invisible, superabundant, and profoundly moral, which their atmosphere holds in solution. Natural enough smells, coloured by circumstances as those of the neighbouring countryside, but humanised, domesticated, confined. An exquisite, skillful, limpid jelly, blending all the fruits of the season which have left the orchard for the storeroom, smells changing with the year, but personal domestic smells, which compensate for the sharpness of hoarfrost with the sweet savour of warm bread. Smells lazy and punctual as a village clock, roving smells, pious smells, rejoicing in a peace which brings only an increase of anxiety, and in an ordinariness which serves as a deep source of poetry to the stranger who passes through their midst without having lived amongst them. The air of these rooms was saturated with the fine bouquet of a silence so nourishing, so succulent, that I couldn't enter them without a sort of greedy enjoyment, particularly on those first mornings, chilly still, of the Easter holidays, when I could taste it more fully because I had just arrived at Cambrai. Before I went in to wish my aunt good day, I would be kept waiting in a little time in the outer room, where the sun, a wintry sun still, had crept in to warm itself before the fire, plastering all the walls and everything in it with a smell of soot, making the room like one of those great open hearths which one finds in the country, or one of the canopied mantelpieces in old castles, under which one sits, hoping that in the world outside it is raining or snowing, hoping almost for a catastrophic deluge, to add the romance of shelter and security to the comfort of a snug retreat. I would turn to and fro between the prayer desk and the stamped velvet armchairs, each one always draped in its crocheted antimacassar, while the fire, baking like a pie, the appetizing smells with which the air of the room was thickly clotted, which the dewy and sunny freshness of the morning had already raised and started to set, puffed them and glazed them and fluted them and swelled them into an invisible though not impalpable country cake, an immense puff pastry, in which, barely waiting to savour the crustier, more delicate, more respectable, but also drier smells of the cupboard, the chest of drawers and the patterned wallpaper, I always returned with an unconfessed gluttony to bury myself in the nondescript, resinous, dull, indigestible and fruity smells of the flowered quilt. In the next room I could hear my aunt talking quietly to herself. She never spoke save in low tones, because she believed that there was something broken in her head and floating loose there, which she might displace by talking too loud. But she never remained for long, even when alone, without saying something, because she believed it was good for her throat, and that by keeping the blood there in circulation, it would make less frequent the chokings and other pains to which she was liable. Besides, in the life of complete inertia which she led, she attached to the least of her sensations an extraordinary importance, endowed them with a protean ubiquity which made it difficult for her to keep them secret, and, failing a confidant to whom she might communicate them, she used to promulgate them to herself in an unceasing monologue which was her sole form of activity. Unfortunately, having formed the habit of thinking aloud, she didn't always take care to see that there was no one in the adjoining room, and I would often hear her saying to herself, "I mustn't forget that I never slept a wink," for never sleeping a wink was her great claim to distinction, and one admitted and respected in our household vocabulary. In the morning, her maid Françoise would not call her, but would simply come to her. During the day, when my aunt wished to take a nap, we used to say just that she wished to be quiet or to rest, and when in conversation she so far forgot herself as to say, "What made me wake up?" or "I dreamed that," she would flush and at once correct herself. After waiting a minute, I would go in and kiss her. She would ask for her tisane, and it would be my duty to shake out the chemist's little package on a plate, the amount of lime blossom required for infusion in boiling water. Presently my aunt was able to dip in the boiling infusion, in which she would relish the savour of dead or faded blossom, a madeleine, of which she would hold out a piece to me when it was sufficiently soft. And in another part of the book, a bit later, here is a passage the author writes about himself as a young man, but still living at home. He says, "I feel there is much to be said for the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost are held captive in some inferior being, in an animal, in a plant, in some inanimate object, and so effectively lost to us until the day, which to many never comes, when we happen to pass by the tree or to obtain possession of the object which forms their prison. Then they start and tremble, they call us by our name, and as soon as we have recognized their voice, the spell is broken. We have delivered them, they have overcome death and returned to share our life. And so it is with our own past. It is a labour in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, in some material object, in the sensation which that material object will give us, which we don't suspect. And as for the object, it depends on chance, whether we come upon it or not before we ourselves must die." Many years had elapsed, during which nothing of Cambrai had any existence for me, when one day in winter, as I came home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, offered me some tea, a thing I did not ordinarily take. I declined at first, and then, for no particular reason, changed my mind. She sent out for one of those short, plump little cakes called petites madeleines, which look as though they have been moulded in the fluted scallop of a pilgrim's shell. And soon, mechanically, weary after a dull day with the prospect of a depressing morrow, I raised to my lips a spoonful of the tea in which I had soaked a morsel of the cake. No sooner had the warm liquid and the crumbs with it touched my palate than a shudder ran through my whole body, and I stopped intent upon the extraordinary changes that were taking place. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, but individual, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. And at once the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its disasters innocuous, its brevity illusory. This new sensation having had on me the effect which love has of filling me with a precious essence, or rather, this essence was not in me, it was myself. I had ceased now to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal. Whence could it have come, this all-powerful joy? I was conscious that it was connected with the taste of tea and cake, but that it infinitely transcended those savours, could not, indeed, be of the same nature as theirs. Whence did it come? What did it signify? How could I seize upon and define it? I drink a second mouthful, in which I find nothing more than in the first, a third which gives me rather less than the second. It is time to stop. The potion is losing its magic. It is plain that the object of my quest, the truth, lies not in the cup, but in myself. The tea has called up in me, but doesn't itself understand, and can only repeat indefinitely, with a gradual loss of strength, the same testimony, which I too cannot interpret, though I hope at least to be able to call upon the tea for it again, and to find it there presently, intact and at my disposal, for my final enlightenment. I put down my cup and examine my own mind. It is for it to discover the truth. But how? What an abyss of uncertainty whenever the mind feels that some part of it has strayed beyond its own borders, when it, the seeker, is at once the dark region through which it must go seeking, where its equipment will avail it nothing. Seek, more than that, create. It is face to face with something which does not so far exist, to which it alone can give reality and substance, which it alone can bring into the light of day. And I begin to ask myself what it could have been, this unremembered state, which brought with it no logical proof of its existence, but only the sense that it was a happy, that it was a real state, in whose presence other states of consciousness melted and vanished. I decided to attempt to make it reappear. I retraced my thoughts to the moment at which I drank the first spoonful of tea. I find again the same state, illumined by no fresh light. I compel my mind to make one further effort, to follow and recapture once again the fleeting sensation. And that nothing may interrupt it in its course, I shut out every obstacle, every extraneous idea. I stop my ears and inhibit all attention to the sounds which come from the next room. And then, feeling that my mind is growing fatigued without having any success to report, I compel it for a change to enjoy the distraction which I have just denied it, to think of other things, to rest and refresh itself before the supreme attempt. And then, for the second time, I clear an empty space in front of it. I place in position before my mind's eye the still recent taste of that first mouthful, and I feel something start within me, something that leaves its resting place and attempts to rise, something that has been embedded like an anchor at a great depth. I don't know yet what it is, but I can feel it mounting slowly. I can measure the resistance. I can hear the echo of great spaces traversed. Undoubtedly, what is thus palpitating in the depths of my being must be the image, the visual memory which, being linked to that taste, has tried to follow it into my conscious mind. But its struggles are too far off, too much confused. Scarcely can I perceive the colourless reflection in which are blended the uncapturable whirling medley of radiant hues, and I cannot distinguish its form, cannot invite it, as the one possible interpreter, to translate to me the evidence of its contemporary, its inseparable paramour, the taste of cake soaked in tea. Cannot ask it to inform me what special circumstance is in question, of what period in my past life. Will it ultimately reach the clear surface of my consciousness? This memory, this old dead moment, which the magnetism of an identical moment has travelled so far to importune, to disturb, to raise up out of the very depths of my being? I cannot tell. Now that I feel nothing, it has stopped, has perhaps gone down again into its darkness, from which who can say whether it will ever rise? 10 times over I must essay the task, must lean down over the abyss, and each time the natural laziness which deters us from every difficult enterprise, every work of importance, has urged me to leave the thing alone, to drink my tea, and to think merely of the worries of today and of my hopes for tomorrow, which let themselves be pondered over without effort or distress of mind. And suddenly the memory returns. The taste was that of the little crumb of Madeleine, which on Sunday mornings at Cambrai, when I went to say good day to her in her bedroom, my Aunt Léonie used to give me, dipping it first in her own cup of lime-flower tea. The sight of the little Madeleine had recalled nothing to my mind before I tasted it, perhaps because I had so often seen such things in the interval, without tasting them, on the trays of pastry cooks' windows, that their image had dissociated itself from those Cambrai days to take its place among other more recent. Perhaps because of those memories so long abandoned and put out of mind, nothing now survived. Everything was scattered. The forms of things, including that of the little scallop shell of pastry, so richly sensual under its severe religious folds, were either obliterated or had been so long dormant as to have lost the power of expansion which would have allowed them to resume their place in my consciousness. But when, from a long distant past, nothing subsists, after the people are dead, after the things are broken and scattered, still alone, more fragile, but with more vitality, more unsubstantial, more persistent, more faithful, the smell and taste of things remain, poised a long time, like souls, ready to remind us, waiting and hoping for their moment amid the ruins of all the rest, and bear unfaltering in the tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence the vast structure of recollection. and once I had recognised the taste of the crumb of Madeleine, soaked in her deconcoction of lime flowers which my aunt used to give me. Immediately the old grey house upon the street where her room was rose up like the scenery of a theatre, to attach itself to the little pavilion opening onto the garden, which had been built out behind it for my parents, and with the house the town, from morning to night and in all weathers, the square where I was sent before luncheon, the streets along which I used to run errands, the country roads we took when it was fine. And just as the Japanese amuse themselves by filling porcelain bowl with water and steeping in it a little crumb of paper, which is without character or form, but the moment they become wet, stretch themselves and bend, take on colour and distinctive shape, become flowers or houses or people, permanent and recognisable. So in that moment, all the flowers in our garden, and in Monsieur Swann's park, and the water lilies on the Vivonne, and the good folk of the village, and their little dwellings, and the parish church, and the whole of Cambrai, under its surroundings, taking their proper shapes and growing solid, sprang into being, town and garden alike, all from my cup of tea. I've just got a little coda at the end. I'd like to point you to one of the many Proust-related books I gathered around me in those years. In 1997, a friend was asked to review Alain de Botton's first non-fiction book, How Proust Can Change Your Life. He lent it to me, and I've now got it on Kindle, as indeed I have the whole of In Search of Time Past, all bought for 99p. So, I was saying, I've now got How Proust Can Change Your Life, and it amused me and educated me and reminded me about how indeed Proust can change your life. Proust wrote very tellingly about art and about architecture, and when he came across Ruskin's writing, he was deeply moved by the way Ruskin saw things and expressed that vision. De Botton says, Proust's encounter with Ruskin exemplified the benefits of reading. The universe suddenly regained infinite value in my eyes, explained Proust subsequently, because the universe had had such value in Ruskin's eyes, and because he had been a genius at transmuting his impressions into words. Ruskin had expressed things which Proust might have felt himself, but couldn't have articulated on his own. In Ruskin, he found experiences which he had never been more than semi-conscious of, raised and beautifully assembled in language. The last words of How Proust Can Change Your Life are, there is no greater homage we could pay to Proust than to end up passing the same verdict on him as he passed on Ruskin, namely, that for all its qualities, his work must eventually also prove silly, maniacal, constraining, false, and ridiculous to those who spend too long on it. To make reading into a discipline is to give too large a role to what is only an incitement. Reading is on the threshold of the spiritual life. It can induce us to it. It does not constitute it. Even the finest books deserve to be thrown aside. Well, I seem to have finished 5 minutes before past. Oh, it was such an effort to get it down to the right length, so I've maybe slightly overdone it. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.